Welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. Let's begin with a passage from Annie Dillard from her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Maybe you know it. Then one day, I was walking along Tinker Creek, thinking of nothing at all, and I saw the tree with lights in it. I saw the backyard cedar where the morning doves roost, charged and transfigured, each cell buzzing with flame. I stood on the grass with the lights in it, grass that was wholly fire, utterly focused and utterly dreamed. It was less like seeing than like being for the first time seen, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. The flood of fire abated, but I'm still spending the power. Gradually, the lights went out in the cedar, the colors died, the cells unflamed and disappeared. I was still ringing. I had been my whole life a bell and never knew it until at that moment I was lifted and struck. I have since only very rarely seen the tree with the lights in it. The vision comes and goes, mostly goes, but I live for it, for the moment when the mountains open and a new light roars in spate through the cracks and the mountains slam. I love this passage. Such a profound experience that she's doing her best to describe. And isn't that what it's always like? The numinous, the mysterious, the moments where eternity or something of the eternal slips in through the temporal. It's just almost impossible to speak about unless you're a poet, or in this case, a kind of mixture of poetry and prose is what I hear in Annie Dillard. And it's this line in here that I'm using as a kind of setup for today. I had been my whole life like a bell and never knew it until at that moment I was lifted and struck. Maybe you know a little of what she's talking about, or maybe what she's talking about is alluring to you in some way, and maybe even a bit frightening. What is it like when our life is struck in such a mysterious way, and suddenly every cell in our body is ringing, and something of the soul, of the heart, of our entire being is on fire in some way, and all we were doing was just walking along the creek side. What do we call these moments? And in fact, maybe we shouldn't call them anything, but of course I'm going to try. In some ways it's in the loosest possible sense, it's a moment of transcendence. It's a moment where we transcend who we think we are. There's something that breaks forth into our too small world. It's like the island of our tiny ego consciousness is flooded by something vast and great like the ocean. And we're not the same. And also, it can't last. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I'm continuing in this series on the Christ symbol, and in releasing these stages, these 7 stages of the life of Christ through a symbolic lens, a life transformed. And today we're on to stage 3 of that. So this is my 5th part in the series, but it's stage 3, what I'm calling Transcendent Encounter. Yeah, it's something that happens to Christ. It's something that is part of the transformative pattern here, part of the transformative experience, this sort of encounter, and I want to talk about it. So that's where we're going, and I hope you're hearing something and kind of looking again at the life of Christ through this symbolic lens. I hope you hear a hint, a guess, a clue, I'm not expecting that, it'll be a bell that will lift you and strike you like the way Annie Dillard is, but maybe there's something in the background that can soften us. Listening to the life of Christ like this, and also reimagining and re-looking at our own life, there's a kind of like the walls of the way we tell stories like start to crack and crumble, and there's a little more porousness and there's a little more openness. Like what might happen if I turn my ear and my heart and my being to these stories? That's what I'm trying to do. So yeah, I don't want to make this introduction too long. I want to get right to it. So I'll just mention maybe 3 quick things. My next Animus program is called The Way of Counsel and the Art of Mirroring. It's April 14 to 18 in Ojai, California. Animus.org is the way to find out about that. Love to see you there. My next program here on my own, like my own program, which I call Wilderness Within, June 12 to 15 here in Michigan, I should say. Details are on my website, kentdobson.com. I'd love to see you there as well, or instead. And then special thanks again to my patrons. Consider becoming a patron if you've thought about it. Just if it's crossed your mind, I'm just bringing it up again. Would love to have your support. And I've been getting to know some patrons, and I'm just really, really grateful. So that's also available to you, patreon.com/Kent Dobson. And yeah, let's keep this story rolling. All right, we are at stage 3 already of the 7. And I'd like to call stage 3 Transcendence. Or encounter, or transcendent encounter, if you want to put it like that. And what I mean by transcendence, maybe that's a starting place, is to transcend your ordinary waking ego consciousness. And by ego, I mean who I think I am, or who you think you are. The tip of the iceberg that we call our conscious awareness. That's the ego. I know the ego gets like a bad reputation in spiritualish circles, but I think that's unnecessary in this sense. It's who we think we are at any given moment. Now, if that's all we think we are, that's a kind of pathological ego. And that is a problem. And it's moments of transcendence that help us grow beyond our ego consciousness. And let's include, by saying that, something like our worldview, our sense of self, our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose, our sense of what we think we might know about God, our beliefs, certainly our ideas, if I didn't already say that. We transcend that for a moment. And that feels like an encounter rather than a thought. It's like a moment of transcendence can be a welling up of the deep self, which cracks the ego wide open. And it's something like peering into the mystery of one's own being, which seems bottomless and eternal. This is what Carl Jung called the self with a capital S. The eternity out of which the thing we call our life emerges. That's an encounter. It can feel like an encounter with other, like the otherness of the other, or other with a capital O. The divine, the mystery is my favorite word for whatever it is that I'm talking about. Also cracks the ego. It feels like, wow, my world is way too small. And it can be scary. Transcendence, moments of transcendence and encounter can be scary. And often, maybe I might even say, I think an element of awe, certainly. And awe in Hebrew, by the way, is related to the word fear. So it's like that strange combination of awe / fear that often comes with the moment of transcendence. I know transcendence sounds like one of those super spiritual words, but it's not really. It's just to transcend your waking, ordinary, small self. And if we don't have tastes of such a thing, which I think all people do, whether or not they could be big or small, I suppose, we don't tend to grow up. We don't tend to, Richard Rohr always says that it's great love and great suffering that does the work. And I think he's right about that. So moments of suffering and moments of great love can be transcended. I even just was thinking about the death of my own father, which my dad had ALS for 15 years, which is a long time to have that disease, for one thing. It's also a very long time to be contemplating and thinking about and planning around and pushing off and ignoring and denying impending death. And once the moment of death came, and in the days and weeks that followed, for me, it felt like there were moments, there were tastes of something transcendent that I was encountering a larger mystery of life itself, that death itself was not a problem. This wasn't a thought I was having. It wasn't an idea. It wasn't something I read in a book. It was an encounter with the raw reality of impermanence and mortality and beauty and grief and sadness, all sort of mixed together. That's a moment of transcendence. And I think when you're talking about examining your life, and here we're trying to examine the life of Jesus, it's important to ask questions about what are my moments of transcendence, where the world cracked open and I cracked open, and my life began to take on a different meaning, a different path, a different aim, a different direction. And the funny thing about transcendence, or encounter as I'm describing it here, is it cannot be manufactured. And it's only encountered. You can't make it happen. I do a lot of wilderness programs, particularly and I'm getting some training at Animas Valley Institute in Colorado. Look it up sometime, around guiding people in these, pristine and amazing environments in a small group, which is very intense. And we're trying to turn up the heat on who we think we are. And a lot of the work is just encouraging a participant, or if I'm a participant, to go out into wild places and to open up to the wild world as it is, and to open up to what begins to surface from the unconscious. And none of that makes anything happen. It's much more like developing a posture of lowering our defenses. That's about the best we can do. Creating a posture that lowers our defenses to the possibility of transcendent moments, of a transcendent encounter, we could say. But we can't manufacture it. Otherwise, I could simply say, hey, come on my retreat. Boom, I guarantee you're going to have a moment of transcendence. Your world will never be the same, but I simply cannot make such promises. I can help people, encourage people, plant certain trap doors in the day and hope for such a thing, but it simply happens. And it's another way of saying the thing that is at work is mystery itself. And it's like St. Paul. He's walking along one day, minding his own business, doing, quote, the work of God, trying to push down this kind of new messianic movement around a crucified savior figure, not very good for the religious establishment. And he's blinded by a light, and he can't see. And he has to be led by the hand, and he's in a world of dissent and darkness. That's encounter. That's divine encounter. And much of what passes as divine encounter, as it comes to us in the biblical text, is not so like he was enveloped in a bright light and felt wonder and peace. It's actually like a harsher, more dangerous, more disruptive. So however the mystery comes is also, we don't have much of a say in that. Hold on a minute, my cat is yelling at me. Speaking of unexpected encounters, that was my, with the otherness of the other, that was my cat wanting in. Okay, so where was I? I think it's worth quoting some James Finley here. He says, we can't make the moment of oceanic oneness happen. We cannot make the moment of oceanic oneness happen. We can only offer a posture of least resistance, which is just such a lovely way of putting it. And what does a path of least resistance look like? It can look like a daily meditation practice, practicing letting go of thoughts and opening to the present, the wildness of the present moment as it is, allowing whatever to surface and letting go of whatever surfaces. I'm not a great meditator. In fact, only recently have I started to engage in a more concrete meditative practice. So I'm no expert in this respect. What else can a path of least resistance look like? Wanders in nature, real wonders where one is not trying to achieve anything, but open up to the wild world as the wild world presents itself, offering a posture of least resistance. The classic word for what I'm describing is prayer. Prayer is offering a posture of least resistance. It's not putting in requests into the divine vending machine and hoping, A1, your choice, B4, comes out the way you want it to come out. That is an extremely mechanistic and childish view of prayer. Prayer is much more like a posture of least resistance. So it does matter. That means something like we can cooperate with the mystery of life and with the divine, but we cannot make moments of union, oneness, mystery, or in Paul's case, blindness happen. It happens unto us. And the other thing I want to say about transcendence, the way I'm using it here, is that it is a state of consciousness. It's not a stage, at least in my view. And Ken Wilber is the one who makes a really big distinction between states and stages. A stage is something like your psycho-spiritual center of gravity has shifted from one stage to the next. And you could even look at these 7 stages of Jesus' life like that. A shifting of the center of the center of gravity within the core of Jesus' being, shifting from one stage to the next. It's possible to look at it that way. Or using any other map that's out there. From egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmos-centric. That's to speak of worldviews more, but those are stages. And not necessarily states, or we shouldn't confuse them. And what happens then is that when we have a taste, a state of consciousness, a state of transcendence, we may say, or encounter, it's possible that it helps us grow, we could say. It helps us begin the mysterious journey from one stage to the next. I'm trying to think of a less fancy way of saying it, from immature to mature, or from immature to a growing maturity. How do we do that? How do we achieve that? Well, the mystery is part of the thing that's at work, and we can cooperate with such a thing. But oftentimes the encounter cracks us enough to be open to the possibility of change. And, W.H. Auden has this great line. He says, we would rather be ruined than changed. We'd rather be ruined than changed. In other words, sometimes we like to cling so tightly to my worldview has to remain the same. We're not saying this consciously. Like, I don't want to change. I don't want to change. I don't want to change. And the coronavirus is like that. It's like it's putting up all this existential, not just existential, but very concrete pressures, economic and fear and illness, all these pressures. And one part of us says, I don't want the world to change. And the world is saying too late, and sometimes all of a sudden there's a crack and you transcend that. Something pushes you through great love or great suffering. And there's a taste of a larger reality. That's a moment of transcendence. That's encounter. And it's possible then to begin the first few steps into the next chapter of your life. And it doesn't guarantee it, but it opens the door, is what I'm saying. Now, that was kind of a long introduction to just a conversation about transcendence. And again, to make it sound less fancy, these are moments where we go beyond who we think we are. And they can be very, very subtle, and we can be barely aware of them, or maybe sometimes we're not even aware of them, or they can be earth-shattering, obvious, the clouds part, and something like a lightning bolt runs straight through us. And I wouldn't say one is better than the other. They just simply are. And so let's turn to what I see as a moment of transcendence in the life of Jesus that puts a new rudder in the ocean of his life and changes his path. Here's the text. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. As Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending like a dove, and a voice came from heaven. You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. If you're familiar with the Christian story at all, those are pretty familiar texts. This is the baptism of Jesus, the symbolic death and resurrection before there's a death and resurrection. This is the submergent. This is submerging into the waters of death, into the waters of the womb and the tomb, into the chaos of the first day of creation, where there's darkness over the water and there's tohu vavohu is the phrase in Hebrew. It's chaos and madness, and out of that emerges order and word and light, and it's a kind of it's the recreation of the world that's happening here. But what I'd like to suggest is that it's something like a moment, an encounter of transcendence for Jesus. And if I can put it real simply, what is it? He hears or experiences a voice from the heavens, and it touches him in a certain way, and cuts to the core and whispers something in his ear. And the whisper is, you are my Son. You belong to the divine. You are a child of the mystery. And I am pleased about this. I mean, what a moment. What a cracking of the ego consciousness. Here's a 30-year-old who's been living at home, the son of a carpenter, probably a carpenter himself, a stonemason, a tekton is what it's called in Greek, a day laborer, and he's got this wild cousin, John the Baptist, who's kind of this apocalyptic preacher of repentance, and Jesus is drawn out to the edge here, out beyond the confines of Nazareth, is what the text is saying. He leaves home base. He begins to walk out on the first half of his life, being led by this guru, prophetic, wild man, out to the edges of the desert, to the Jordan River itself, the very river at the heart of the Jewish people, where they crossed from their wandering phase of their collective story into the promised land, this symbolically rich, this mythically rich river flowing right down the center of the land of Israel. This is where John is baptizing, and Jesus immerses himself in these waters, the same waters that his ancestors entered to enter the promised land. And here he's doing something like leaving his old way of life, being immersed in the Jordan River and coming out into this new kingdom, what he eventually will call the kingdom of God. So this is a profound moment. And here's where kind of the mystery of cooperation and will and conscious act seems to interact with the mystery of the divine. So did Jesus choose this? No and yes. In chapter 2 or stage 2, it was the calling that lured him out beyond the confines of Nazareth. Out beyond the edges of who he thought he was. And that has to be heeded. Now, you can refuse it, and you can refuse it a half a dozen times or more, or the rest of your life. But the will is involved in beginning to take a step into the zone unknown. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's out in the desert. He chose this. He walked out. He wanted to be near enough to the words and phrases and energy and force field of John the Baptist, to be close to that kind of evocative, creative, erotic fire. And yet, upon doing what he was, quote, supposed to do, John's down there baptizing. And Jesus is saying something like, I'm going to submit to this immersion. I want to leave my old life. It has to be this way, he says in another version of this text. John, you have to baptize me. It has to be this way. And up out of the water, the sky cracks open, and there's a kind of encounter that changes the course of his life. Or we could say, opens up the possibility that the center of gravity of Jesus' life will move from family, Nazareth, that kind of working vocation, kind of attraction to Judaism and the temple, we could say, but into something that he does not yet know. And the whispering is saying something like, you belong. You are my kid. You're the son of the Father. And I know if you're a Christian and you've been raised with these sort of certain theological ideas, we don't have to dismiss them, but we can say something like, I guess it's important to say, this idea of being the Son of God, which we've turned into a kind of exclusivity when it comes to the Christian tradition. We'd say something like, only Jesus is the Son of God, is certainly not what Hebrew consciousness imagined at the time. Even King David is called the Son of God. So it's a symbolic way of saying you're a child of the divine. You're a child of Yahweh, if you want to be even more specific. But you're a child of the mystery, a son or a daughter of God. And for that to flood into your being can change your life. I guess part of being a human is to feel orphaned in a way. I don't know if, this is actually quite common. It's a psychological phenomenon, which I don't want to go into great detail of, but I don't know if you ever felt this when you were a kid, like you looked at your parents and you thought something like, who are these people? Am I really their kid? I mean, I don't seem to think or believe or act or sometimes even look like them. Where did I come from? Am I the mailman's kid or whatever? I don't know. It's a pretty common psychological phenomenon, as I said before. But I think more than that, it's just a dimension of our own humanness. Some part of us feels like we belong, and another part of us feels orphaned. And what I think Jesus is experiencing here is a kind of divine regrounding of his life. You might feel orphaned, Maybe your dad died recently, which is Catholic tradition here. Joseph is gone. And here you are at home with a grieving mother and younger siblings. And the right thing to do is to put your hand to the plow and stay put and provide for your mom and to take care of your siblings and to be the father of the household. And in his baptism, he's experiencing, actually, I'm the son of a different father here. And it's time to listen to this voice. You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. And you can't make the moment of oceanic oneness happen. And same with Jesus. It just happens. And he has a taste, one taste, which changes the course of his life, we could say. And let's bring out maybe a few other nuances here. One of the things I think is interesting is the language. It says that he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit, the wind of God descending like a dove, which is a little like that creation language where the Spirit of God is hovering like a dove, we could say, over the waters of chaos on the first day of creation. So this is really, really rich language that's being used here. But, you know, I have all these images in my head from, Bibles with pictures in them and, Christian bookstore paintings of a dove, sort of flying down from the sky. But what's interesting, it says, he saw the heavens being torn open. And this, by the way, is, look up Isaiah chapter 64 sometime. You'll see the same tearing open of the heavens. So this is a kind of echoing back to some of the language of Isaiah, which Isaiah is, more than any other prophet, I think, influences the language of Jesus and the kinds of things he does in the world, the kind of attention he has toward the poor, for example, very Isaiah-like. The kinds of acts he does in the world. Isaiah walked around naked for 3 years, saying to the people of Jerusalem, this is how you appear before God. And Jesus, marches in the temple and symbolically destroys it, saying, you've turned this into a den of robbers. These are kind of the prophetic acts. Anyway, my getting very sidetracked. Isaiah is an important voice in the shaping of Jesus's consciousness. But here we have, it's very personal. He saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending like a dove, not a dove descending, but like a dove. This is all kind of very strange and way of bringing words to an experience that is essentially ineffable and unnameable. One of the things I got from Abraham Heschel, this is, I believe, in his book, The Prophets. And first of all, he says, I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing here of Heschel, which is a little unfair. One way of thinking about a prophet is that they challenge the political and religious establishment. That's really a good definition for a prophet. They're not predicting the future necessarily, and many of the things the prophets quote predict don't come true in a very concrete way. They're often just threats. If you don't change your ways, this is going to happen to you. And sometimes they're right on. And it's not, we sometimes think God must be whispering secrets of the future in their ear. But if you're a parent, or I used to be a high school teacher, I could make all kinds of predictions that were mostly true. Like, if you don't do this, you're gonna fail. That's not prophetic insight. That's just insight. That's just stating the obvious. And that's oftentimes what the prophets were doing, stating the obvious. If you don't change your ways, you're going to be destroyed. Your enemies are going to surround you. So that's the prophetic voice. But what Abraham Heschel says, and I think I find so challenging, is he says, first of all, whatever the prophets say, they say with tears. It breaks their heart. And I don't see a lot of that with the so-called prophetic voices in our culture right now. You know, the social justice Instagram posts are not said with tears. So it's not really prophetic in the classic sense. It's more finger pointing and scapegoating is what's happening on both sides. I'm picking on the left in a way, but I can just as easily pick on the right, no problem. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just saying that, file that away. You can check in with yourself. Am I sort of standing up for something, and am I doing it with tears? Or the Buddhist way of saying it would be with the heart of compassion. And if the answer is no, don't think about for a moment you're some sort of social justice prophet in the classic sense. You might just be bitching about things you don't like to see. So that's an aside. I'm still building up to what Heschel says. So he says the actual language of the prophets, in other words, what we have written in the Bible, is not divine encounter itself. It's words about encounter. It's words trying to interpret and frame and name transcendence, encounter itself. He says the most important question is whether or not ancient people or any person really has contact with divinity. That's the question. Not are the words in the Bible divine. That's the wrong kind of question. It's much more like, is encounter possible? Is transcendence possible? Is it possible for our own smallness to be cracked open by something larger? Because if that's the case, the world is a sacred dance. And the language we actually have in the Bible is hinting around that sacred dance. It's giving us hints and clues and guesses about that sacred dance. And what, if I can use contemporary language, what the expansion of consciousness might look like. Or to use Christian language, growing into the mind of Christ. Or to use Buddhist language, taking on the Buddha mind. The slow unfolding transformation of consciousness through history, through time, and through our own personal lives. Something like that. And that happens in part through moments of encounter. So what I'm saying here about Jesus, he saw the heavens being torn open. This is that highly personalized encounter with the mystery. The language of which is just trying to get close enough, like a finger pointing to the moon. The finger here is the text and the language of the text. The moon is the encounter. And who has the encounter in the story? Jesus has the encounter. It's his wildly unique opening. And I'm saying that because, on the one hand, it's important to suggest, hey, Jesus had something like this, because it opens up the possibility that we might experience such a thing. One of the things you can say, hands down, is true about the Jesus story. I don't care if you're a traditional, orthodox, believe all the doctrine Christian, or if you're not at all, if you're the opposite of that somehow. One of the things you can say hands down is Jesus is saying what is happening to me can happen to you. He's giving it away. The same spirit he receives here, the wind, he gives away. He says, you can experience, any of you, rich, poor, male, female, prostitute, priest, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's that democratic. God is not picky. The divine is not picky. Offer a posture of least resistance to the mystery of divine, and it will break you wide open. I'm not special, is what Jesus is saying in the course of his life. And I think it's so important, I feel like, what I'm saying here, because we tend to specialize everything. Wow, isn't it special that Jesus had this moment of oneness, and he's told he's the Son of God, and I'm just going to worship him as the Son of God, rather than hearing it as the possibility of our own experience of daughtership and sonship, becoming a child of the divine, of the great mystery, of the mother, the divine mother, if you want to broaden the gender here, which is totally, I think, valid. It's even valid from a linguistic point of view. The spirit is in Hebrew is a feminine word. Okay, so the divine is masculine and feminine inside the Bible itself, as it should be. It's just very subtle, and we can't hear it always in English. So the spirit here is descending on Jesus, and he's experiencing a kind of oneness, a kind of union, a kind of encounter. Now, the other thing I want to say about transcendence is that the language we bring to it is often mythopoetic. That phrase I got from Bill Plotkin, actually, Anna Valley Institute, and check out his books. I mentioned on my podcast about a bunch, mythopoetic. But I've also heard James Hollis use a similar word, and James Hillman, Robert Bly, this kind of mythos and poetic way of putting things. And experiencing the sonship, I am the Son of God, or what, to use Jesus' self-referential title, the Son of Man or humanity, which I'll say more about in a second. This is a mythopoetic way of naming one's identity. It's a mythopoetic way of saying, who am I in the world? Well, I'm the Son of God. Who am I in the world? I'm the Son of humanity. Who am I in the world? I'm a daughter of the divine. Who am I in the world? And it's functioning like a symbolic name here. So another way of putting it is Jesus is being renamed. He's not Yeshua of Nazareth anymore. He's the Son of humanity. He's the child of God. And that's a renaming. And renaming, obviously from the Hebrew Bible, is a very important, richly symbolic idea. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, Jacob to Israel, and so forth and so on. On down the list you go. This renaming is a mythopoetic way of saying my center of gravity has shifted. And I've been named by something far greater than my parents, far greater than my own self-proclaimed names. I've been named by another. And the only way I can talk about it is symbolically. I think this is one reason why Jung says moments like this are often image-based. He actually says the soul is much more like an image. It rises up and gives us a certain image. And inside that image, it gives us a clue about the meaning of our own life, the shape of our own life. That's a moment of transcendence on the soul level. We get a glimpse of the kind of person we are to be in the world. And that's what I think is happening here with Jesus. He becomes the Son of Man, the Son of humanity. And as he says later in his life, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life. And that's the way he's going to walk out into the world from this point on and embody that and find out what that means and bump into the risks and challenges along the way of trying to put that forward in the world. That's a kind of mythopoetic identity, to quote Bill Plotkin, that acts as a kind of, I was going to say rudder, but I've already used a sail, that the wind catches from time to time and pushes you out further and further into the ocean that is life. So just to back off a little bit and to ask some questions here, some personal questions, what are your moments of transcendence? Has the mystery ever cracked you open a little bit and given you a hint, a clue, an image about the meaning of your own life, about the essence of who you are, a seed that wishes to be planted in the soil to grow into something that you cannot yet see, that you cannot yet imagine, that's a moment of transcendence. It's a whispering, it's a seed, it's a planting here. It's one moment on the bank of the Jordan River. And packed inside that one moment of encounter. I mean, I wonder if a few minutes later Jesus felt something like, wait, did that really happen to me? This has happened to me with working with dreams, and even what I would call some day world visions. And I say that with a lot of hesitation, because I'm not claiming to be some kind of visionary, but moments where, in a sense, the sky opened up and I saw something, and something touched me and rose up from my own depths, or the divine out met the divine within, or my own deep self met the greater self of the world. I don't know how to say it. And something like an arrow ran through the center of my being. And it was both a change your life kind of moment, and here's a sense of the direction toward which you should be walking, that you're invited to walk in the world in a certain way, and to begin to embody these little hints. So that's what I mean by encounter here, the possibility of transcendence. And I think maybe I want to read one more text that happens later in life, because Jesus seems to have, he may have had many. He may have had something at the temple at age 12. He may have, had something, who knows? There's, 3 or 4 of these moments, one of which we know a little bit about. So let me just read one more here. Okay, here's the text. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, is it good for us to be here? Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them. And a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man, here's that phrase again, had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what, quote, rising from the dead meant, which, by the way, gives you a clue as to what kind of teacher Jesus was. He talks in parables and symbols and myths and stories and images, and even the disciples like, what does that really mean? So the fact that we're still doing that, I think, is a way of saying that's what the path is like. And language is our best attempt at naming something that's hard to name. So a couple of interesting things about this passage. It's another moment, I think, of transcendence, of divine encounter. And it's not just with Jesus. There's something more collective about this, more communal. Not only is Jesus there, but so is Peter and James and John, and then Moses and Elijah appear, and a cloud envelops them, and there's some confusion and some mystery about the whole thing. But this is much more of a collective kind of experience. And the first moment that we're made aware of, a kind of divine encounter type moment, it seems highly personalized with Jesus and the Jordan River here. But this seems a little less so. There's a collective dimension. And so in a way, maybe I'd like to suggest that this reflects sort of the direction of things more broadly. It's not, in other words, enlightenment is not just some sort of privatized thing. It's like, I'm the Son of God, my personal enlightened state that I'm going to keep to myself. No, it asks something of us, and it begins to envelop those in our community. And the mystery breaks out of that highly personalized place to enfold more and more. That's is the direction of things. There's something in Buddhism called the Bodhisattva vow. And the vow is, I refuse enlightenment until all sentient beings are enlightened. I think that's what this transfiguration story is about on one level. No, it's not about Jesus and his privatized enlightenment. It's about Peter and James and John, and even the dead are involved, Moses and Elijah. That's the way I live my life in widening circles that move out across the world, says Rilke. And here it is swinging out wider and wider. And so that, I think, is just worth mentioning. There are also some, it's pretty interesting, some biblical background and allusions are at work here. This is very much like what happened on Mount Sinai, where Moses ascends the mountain. Aaron is up there for a while, and then Moses is up there all by himself. And a cloud descends and envelops the entire mountain. And Moses is up there for 40 days and 40 nights, kind of like Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. So there's a little bit of that ancient kind of Sinai imagery coming here and enveloping the story. And the voice speaks again here. And it's almost like what Jesus hears at his baptism, except the voice doesn't seem to be speaking to Jesus. It seems to be speaking to Peter and James and John, who are in this like totally confused state. Should we build shelters? I think they're saying, I'm hearing, that should we make this some kind of sacred site? Like what is exactly happening here? That's what I think is meant by shelter, kind of like a tabernacle, which was a glorified tent, which was the original kind of traveling sacred site of the Jewish people, we could say. And maybe Peter's thinking something like that. We don't really know. It tells us he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, but the voice says, "This is my son, whom I love." I think it says whom I love. Let me look it up again. This is my son. Yeah, whom I love. Listen to him. And I think that is directed toward Peter and James and John, and we can maybe even hear it as a kind of universal message that is coming our way as we're enveloped in the same kind of mysterious cloud. Listen to him. And I think the appearance of Moses and Elijah give it an additional richness. What I'm hearing in that is that Jesus is counted among the ancestors. And in the ancient world, both the East and the West and the Native American tradition, and ancestors play a huge role in the spiritual life. Praying to ancestors, talking to ancestors, honoring ancestors. We've almost completely abandoned such a thing. I mean, we'll occasionally put up statues to people, and that's maybe an attempt, but oftentimes that's just, making an ideological claim. That's what a lot of our statues are. It's not an ongoing conversation with the ancestors, which I think ancient people had, and I think it's something that's worth preserving and cultivating and working with, because we're not born tabula rasa. We're not born tabula rasa, blank slate, biologically. We're not born tabula rasa when it comes to the psyche. We come preloaded with things, we could say. The way your phone comes preloaded with software is, I hate the comparison to technological metaphors, but whatever. You see what I mean. And part of that is our own lineage and our own tradition and more than that, the wisdom tradition itself. The story is saying whatever Jesus is embodying is not just about him. It's what has always been embodied by the great prophets and teachers. They've all had contact with the divine. They've all been enveloped in the cloud. They all are part of the transformation of human consciousness. And Jesus is counted in this lineage. So listen to him. Don't put him aside. He stands on, the shoulders of his own, of giants, of the ancestors, of the wisdom tradition. And in a way, that's like deeply comforting to any of us who are on the path, because, when a guru comes out of the blue and begins some sort of message that is highly unique and doesn't seem to be connected to any kind of wisdom tradition, I think that's rather suspect. And the encounter that the disciples are having is sort of making sure they know this is part of something larger. And I think an interesting thing that happens, just contextually speaking, I don't want to talk about the whole story, but just before this, Peter announces that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus says, yes, you're right. But flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven did. And on this rock, I will build my church. And the institutional Christianity, in part, read that. And I say in part because institutional Christianity is quite nuanced, as Peter being something like the first pope, and on this statement and on this person, I'm going to build something. And I think that's important to name because that happens right before this transfiguration event, because it's setting the course for Peter and James and John and Mary Magdalene and those who come after Jesus to take their rightful place here, to be one more member in the wisdom lineage here, that have tasted the divine and have lived to tell about it, and are inviting others into this kind of relationship. That's what I mean by communal. So I'm not exactly sure what we can conclude by this, but broadly speaking, moments of transcendence can feel very personal and they can feel collective. Maybe they can even happen in a group setting. And I don't mean, like at a Fish concert where everybody's caught up in a certain kind of emotion, but I mean, can include friends, neighbors, relatives, siblings, small groups, churches, a sense of we are experiencing something. We are encountering something. And it's always been this way. Something like that, I think, is in the image of the transfiguration here. And I think maybe one more thing is worth mentioning here. There are a lot of things in this passage, and I could sort of go line by line, but I'm trying to do a little bit of an overview. There's something intriguing about Jesus' appearance, this white, dazzling white, bleached white, kind of purified, might be one illusion here, or priest-like. The priests all had to wear white in the temple. And there's even something to the white garments that Jesus was wrapped up with in the tomb, which are laid to the side of the tomb, and there's a bright light involved in a kind of resurrection. There's a little foreshadowing here that the Christ symbol transcends even Jesus's ordinary humanness and transcends death. There's a taste of it here. Just as Moses and Elijah transcend death, that's part of what's coming through in the passage. It's as if they're still alive because they're still alive. And I'm not talking about it in some sort of technical, they're in heaven, chilling at a beach, drinking Corona. I mean it in that the truth that they embodied is a kind of eternal truth. and they're still very much alive. Moses and Elijah and Jesus. And Jesus is experiencing, and the disciples are experiencing, a taste of that before death, which is coming, which is impending. And the Gospels are really turning on this transfiguration encounter and on the passage right before it, that it's not going to be the same. In fact, on the level of destiny, we could say, Jesus turns toward Jerusalem at this point, comes down off the mountain, and walks to his death. I mean, a few events happen along the way, but the aim of his life now is moving toward some sort of terrible destiny. And there's a taste here in the Transfiguration that death will not have the final word. And I think the imperative, "This is my son, whom I love, listen to him," still echoes through the canyons of time, down into the present world, and spills into the present crisis that we're in. What are we listening to? To whom are we listening? Where is the wisdom? Where is the truth? I guess the Christ symbol here is rising, is becoming apparent. The eternal dimension of this complex symbol, the disciples get a taste of for a moment. They taste it in this kind of moment of transcendence, and they open their eyes again, and it's all gone. And back down the mountain and back toward real life, they begin to walk. And again, that brings me back to something I said at the beginning. There's a difference between states and stages. They enter this kind of state of transcendence, this moment, and they can't stay there. They're kicked back out into the ordinariness of life. They can't sit up on the mountain in the shelter for the rest of their lives. That's not what's happening. They're encountering something that hopefully will begin to alter the course of the whole community. And the fact that we're speaking about it now in 2020 tells you something of the eternal nature of this mysterious moment. So that's as much as I want to say, because that's about all I can say on the Transfiguration. It's one of the strangest and more mystical texts in the entire New Testament. And it's a little different in each of the Gospels, but the main gist of it is still quite mystical. So, where does that leave us? I think that brings us to some questions along the lines of transcendence. Stage 3, transcendence and encounter. Here are the questions that are occurring to me. Are you walking in a way or with a posture of least resistance? Please hear me asking these questions of myself as well. I'm a participant here, just like Peter and James and John and you. Are we walking in the world in a certain way of least resistance to the possibility of oceanic oneness or of transcendence, of encounter, to have our egos and our stories cracked wide open? Are there disciplines we can do right now, today? Stop the podcast and enter into a kind of prayer posture, meditation and walking and contemplation and contemplative prayer and silence and solitude and fasting, and you come up with a list that you already know is to offer a posture of least resistance. I'm telling you, as you know, nothing in our culture supports this, or virtually nothing supports this. Certainly nothing in mainstream culture, not in the media, not on your news feed, not on your social media sites. Virtually nothing supports this. It wants to take up all the space and offer all kinds of input when the posture is about the absence of that. It's about emptying. It's about self-emptying. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit to the next stage. But there's a clue here already. Offering the path of least resistance to the possibility of oceanic oneness. That's to quote James Finley. Here's another question. Are you willing to drop the stories you have about your life? Are you willing to drop the stories you have about your life? I'm not against stories. Stories help us make sense of events. And this is why early psychological and spiritual work is often about telling your story and reclaiming your story and bringing new language to your story and taking tests like the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs or entering a certain kind of therapy that helps you rewrite, in a way, story. Absolutely essential. And then there is also the letting go of that story and those stories, the ones that have served you well enough. And that's what Peter, in a way, is unwilling to do in the Transfiguration. That whatever story is operating, let us put up 3 shelters. Is it good for us to be here? You know, we can put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Whatever operating system is takes over is the very thing that needs to be let go of and cracked and dismantled and unraveled and whatever you want to say about it. I just thought of the Adrienne Rich poem, Diving into the Wreck. She has this line, and it's something like going down. The image is going down into the very bottom of the ocean to see the wreckage. And she says, the wreck and not the story of the wreck. That's that kind of raw exposure, raw vulnerability to the realities of one's own life, to the wreckages and not the stories of the wreck. And same goes with encounter with other, or if you want to use kind of external oriented language here, a voice from heaven. No, not the stories of how it should go or how it ought to go or what I know it would tell me if I had such an encounter. But the stories have to go. Are you willing to drop the stories you have about your life? And Peter's so unwilling to drop the story he even has about his own life and about the life of Jesus that Jesus calls him Satan right after this. And says, you do not have in mind the things of God, of the mystery, but of human beings. You're so locked into your ideological framework, to sound contemporary. Here's another question. What does it mean to listen to Jesus? What does it mean to listen? Listen to him. That's the imperative. That's what the spirit voice. In rabbinic Judaism, it's called the bat kol, which means the daughter voice of God. The bat kol. What does it mean to listen? It's just whispering. Listen to him. What does it mean to listen to Jesus now in the 21st century? And what Jesus are we listening to? To bring it back to the beginning of the podcast. What does it mean to listen, to really listen? And I think we can broaden it to include, what does it mean to listen to the ancestors? To Moses and Elijah and the ancestors outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I think about my own Celtic ancestors. How might they be standing in the cloud with me? And what are they whispering? What seeds of wisdom need to blow into our present world? And how can I open my ears up to such a thing? What does it mean to listen to Jesus, to the ancestors, to wisdom herself? 2 more questions. What what are the moments that have cracked you open? I mean, what are the moments that have cracked you open? And I think, Richard Rohr says that he's talking about brain science, really. I heard him give a lecture. My wife went to the living school, and so I got access to a lot of amazing things for a couple of years. And he talks about how the human brain, has evolved to cling to negative emotion. Why? Because it helps us survive. If we see a snake and that snake bites us, and we want to hang on to that. We have to walk differently in the world, and that kind of stuff gets transferred. The psyche itself transfers it, we could say. And negative emotion helps us survive. It's reactive. It's the fight or flight mechanism. And our brain is really good at holding on to these. It's not very good at holding on to the positive. And so even moments of oceanic oneness can slip, I think about some of the most profound moments of my own life, like the birth of my own children, and just even less dramatic ones, just tiny moments of mystery and wonder and awe and gratitude, and how quickly, one negative email can just rob that kind of amazing joy and gratitude. So it's much more like a discipline to cling to turn over, to contemplate, to write about, to talk about those very subtle moments. So I'm asking you, what are the moments that have cracked you open? Moments of transcendence, where you have transcended who you think you are by no choice of your own, because the mystery decided to reveal the mystery to you. And maybe there's more in there than you ever thought possible. So journaling about these moments, talking about them with someone you trust, drawing them, writing a poem about these moments, not to interpret them. That's not what I'm saying. Quickly create a story, but just to savor, to let them sink in, to find out if there's more work that is yet to happen unto you, to open yourself up in that way. What are the moments that have cracked you open? Suffering, love, joy, union, surprise, synchronicities, whatever. And to try to bring some language around them, just as the gospel writers tried to bring language about these events that happened in the life of Jesus. So here's the final question. What images are working you? What soul-oriented images, like Jesus' sonship here, the Son of humanity, the Son of man, the Son of God, you are my child. What images are working you that came to you as you came up out of the water? What are they? This is just an extension of the previous question. Is there a little hint, a clue, a seed about the unique way your life is oriented, and the crack in your persona, your mask, and your ego was wide enough for that to sink in for a moment, or to creep up, or to well up from the depths? And the question is something like this. What if you turned your attention toward this image as if it was the most important gift you ever received? How would it transform your life? Because I think what Jesus did is he took these moments and treated them as if they were the most important life-changing moments that ever happened to him, and he oriented his life around them, and by doing so, he embodied what was only his to embody in the world. He lived a soul-oriented life, we could say. He let the divine move through him, and had the courage to live courageously in the world, trusting these little hints and guesses. I mean, that's the kind of life that I want to live. And I think that's the kind of life that Jesus is saying you can live, you can model, you can embody. Now, the image or the images that you're carrying, that you've experienced tastes of as you've come up out of the water, are different. They're unique. They're wildly unique. They may not be son of man or son of humanity or daughter of God or who knows what they might sound like, feel like, as you bring your own mythopoetic language around these core images. Maybe it's something as simple as giving and receiving love. That's not so much of an image, but maybe there's an image that's associated with that. Or to be a defender of the ancient ways, or a warrior on the path of love, or I don't know. I'm just riffing on possibilities that it's not my task to name yours. It's your task to begin to bring some language around those beckonings, around those callings, and around those encounters that give you, it's like for a moment, the veil gets peeled back and the shape of your own life is seen. And it comes like a seed. And what you do with that is then go plant it in your real, ordinary, everyday life, in your relationships, in the way you inhabit the world, in your work life and your play life, and in your particular zip code. That's where it's lived out. It's not to be held in some precious place on some mountain enveloped in a cloud. You come down and you begin to live. Which brings me to the next stage.